It's Wednesday, January 13th, the year 2016, and this is the year 3000 NFL Mock Draft, the weekly NFL Draft podcast where we talk about all things NFL Draft, whether it's before the draft, hinting at college football, combine, or after the draft, looking at rookies, some of the young guys, and at the NFL right now, obviously, with myself and Rob Staten of SeahawksDraftBlog.com, things are a little bit more Seattle-centric, and we'll get to the Seahawks in the second half of the show, talk about their game against the Minnesota Vikings, their upcoming game against the Carolina Panthers, Cam Newton versus Russell Wilson, all that fun stuff. Last week on the show, Rob, if you remember, I said if anyone has a theme song to send it in. You remember?
I do, and someone did get in touch this week, so...
They did. And I'm going to play it for you right now. Hopefully, if in the future we like it, we will drop it in more efficiently. So this is through a laptop going into a microphone, forewarning. But I like this, so tell me what you think.
3000 NFL Mock Draft.
3000 NFL Mock Draft.
With your friends Kenneth and Rob. Talking about the NFL and the draft and the Seahawks.
3000 NFL Mock Draft.
3000 NFL Mock Draft.
That's real good.
Kenny, does that at one point say, with your friends Kenny and Rob?
With your friends Kenneth and Rob, correct.
I love it. It's great. Maybe Matt could give us an outsider's view on that.
Yeah, we've got Matt Brown here, the college football expert and editor over at SportsOnEarth.com. And Matt, you're a first-time listener of that theme song. What did you think?
It's just the most amazing podcast intro music I have ever heard in my life, or at least in the last 24 hours.
Well, yeah, I'll take that. I asked for something futuristic because this. People asked last week as well, or in the comments section, why it's called 3000 NFL Mock Draft. It's been a while since I've said it, I guess, which is just people. I think it's funny that people talk about, well, we're doing a 2017 NFL Mock Draft, which is ridiculous. You're not going to get anything right there. It's just something to do, and people will even go 2018 probably because you're looking at maybe freshmen, and you just want to start imagining them in the NFL. And I feel like we're going to go all the way to year 3000. So that's how this podcast got its name. And like I said, we will be covering college football, and the college football season is over. We started this podcast 1 week before the college season began. We had our predictions. Probably we both predicted something like Alabama would win the national championship. And sure enough, here we are on Wednesday, 2 days after Alabama wins the national championship. Matt, you were at the game. A lot of national championships they suck, and they're boring, and they're no good to watch. It's really just, it seems, blowout central for one side, typically Alabama, but this wasn't a bad one. What were your thoughts on the national championship game this year being there? Was it one of the better ones you've ever seen?
It absolutely was. I mean, it kind of, I think, surpassed any expectation, because even when Alabama's playing, we know Alabama's really talented and all that, but there's kind of an expectation that it's going to be like a slow, I don't know, kind of just physical and not necessarily, pretty to watch. And my prediction was 24-23, and I guess for a time it looked like that might be around the right score. But then, both teams kind of took off with big plays, and Nick Saban getting aggressive with the onside kick, and you had Kenny Drake returning a kick for a touchdown. You had O.J. Howard taking advantage of blown Clemson coverage and having over 200 yards as a tight end, even though he hadn't had a touchdown in 2 years. And obviously Deshaun Watson for Clemson put on a show that basically nobody else is capable of against the Alabama defense, which just gave up nothing for weeks and weeks. And, shut out Michigan State in the first playoff game. And Watson has a phenomenal game. Clemson puts up over 500 yards. I mean, I don't think you could ask for much more. I mean, it wasn't USC Texas in 2005, but it's possible that nothing will ever be that again. This is, maybe on that second tier of great college football national championships, and it was just a great back and forth game with two teams who clearly deserve to be there.
Rob, you only get to watch the games from home. What would you like to ask Matt from someone who actually got to be there in person?
Well, I thought it looked like a great game from over here in the United Kingdom, and like Matt said, and some of the times the games aren't great. This one was a really entertaining game. I just wonder, from maybe it's a sort of good to sort of get an opinion of somebody who was there. When you sort of look at the get off of the Clemson defensive line, when I was sort of watching it here at home, I thought they were really good at sort of finishing a lot. I mean, they sacked Coker an awful lot in this game, but I just thought their get off was quite slow, and I thought that was interesting to diagnose the Alabama offensive line, because I thought they didn't do too great. They get the initial because the get off from the defensive ends wasn't great, but then Kevin Dodd just seemed to be blowing past the right tackle every single time that he was rushing. Shaq Lawson obviously had a very productive game as well. So do you have any sort of takes on the performance of the Clemson defensive line against that Alabama front?
Yeah, the Alabama offensive line kind of had a strange season where, I mean, obviously they were pretty good in the run game. Derrick Henry wins the Heisman rushes for 2,000 yards. But, they were kind of up and down in pass protection, and teams created negative plays against them kind of all year. And Clemson, few teams were better as a defense at creating negative plays than the Tigers. And everybody kind of knew Shaq Lawson was good. He leads the nation in tackles for loss. But Kevin Dodd really kind of stepped up and made a lot of plays. I mean, I don't think anybody raised their stock, or at least the national awareness of their existence in the playoff better than Kevin Dodd, who was kind of just known as a role player and overshadowed by Lawson, obviously overshadowed last year by all that talent Clemson had with Vic Beasley, etc. And he had a great game against Oklahoma. Shaq Lawson missed most of that game with a knee injury. I think Dodd had 3.5 tackles for loss in that game. I think he had 3 sacks on Monday against Alabama. So, it's unbelievable what Clemson did this year, because they were the number one rank in many categories. They were at the top last year in defense, and they lose Beasley, they lose Grady Jarrett, they lose Stephon Anthony, they lose pretty much their entire front seven. And despite that, they still had a top 10 defense for most of this season. And Brent Venables, their defensive coordinator, did a terrific job. Their linebackers stepped up as well, Ben Boulware, B.J. Goodson. And Carlos Watkins at tackle. Christian Wilkins, who's going to be a rising star, was a true freshman this year, played a lot at defensive tackle. I think it's going to be hard for them to duplicate this again next year, because a lot of these guys are going to the draft. We saw a lot of declarations today. Kevin Dodd's going. Lawson will be in the draft. Mackenzie Alexander, the star corner, will be gone. Jaron Kearse at safety. And I just, Clemson was here because of Deshaun Watson, yes, but because of how incredible of a job they did of replacing that defense. And it's going to be hard for them to do that again next year, although the expectations will still be high because they're going to have Watson and a lot of that offense back.
I mean, I found myself during the game, really being I don't really care who wins. I'm just watching the game. I guess it's just more interesting to see Clemson beat in Alabama. That's probably the motivation for all of the millions of fans out there like me that just don't really, need to see Alabama win every national championship. So I found myself wanting to at least see something happen, a close game, maybe a final play, and it almost did. And everything sort of centered around Deshaun Watson and wanting to see this guy go out there. And I think it's one of these rare instances where you could actually say that the MVP of the game was on the losing team. How do you sort of feel that Deshaun Watson's future will play out? I mean, he's going to be the Heisman favorite next year. I've seen where, Clemson could be the national championship favorite, even at losing all those guys. What is sort of his future, do you think, next year, and what do you think is his future in the NFL?
Yeah, I get plenty of things wrong. I had USC in the playoff before this season and all that, but I had Deshaun Watson as the number 1 ranked quarterback in June, and that one proved to be right. Obviously he was really, really talented out of high school. Clemson, he committed to Clemson as a high school sophomore, and for 2 years they built their recruiting classes around the fact that, hey, you're going to get to play with this guy. And it's a risk to take, but it all paid off because his development's been exceptional. I mean, just this year, if you think about it, he played, I think, in 7 games as a freshman. He had injury problems. He tore his ACL last November. So this season, he came back from a torn ACL. He came back from his offensive coordinator, Chad Morris, left to take the SMU head coaching job. By the end of September, Clemson was starting 5 new offensive linemen. Watson's best receiver, Mike Williams, suffered a season-ending injury in week 1. So you had all this, turmoil basically for the Clemson offense, all this change, and the way they came together and the way Watson played, I mean, it's like kind of like the defense just responding from all those departures. I mean, it was kind of an incredible job for them to get to this point, to go 14-0, to almost beat Alabama. Watson got better as the season progressed. He threw a few too many interceptions this year, threw 13 picks, had a bad pick in the championship game, but he's still young. He was a sophomore, new talent around him, a little bit different system. And, he spent half the year just trying to get 100%. I mean, they didn't really run him much early in the season because they were worried about his knee, worried about the new offensive line. But by the end of the season, I mean, coming into the Alabama game, he had rushed for over 100 yards 5 of the 6 games. He throws one of the prettiest deep balls in the country. They didn't push the ball downfield a lot necessarily, especially Deion Kane, their best deep threat, was suspended for the playoff, and Williams was out for most of the year. But he's a guy who throws a pretty deep ball. He's very poised.
Can you see him successfully? Can you see him successfully running a zone read option at the pro level?
Yeah, I think he's a guy who's proven to be explosive and makes good decisions. A lot of his success against Alabama running was from when plays broke down and he had to improvise. I mean, because just running design runs against Alabama doesn't work too much. He had some success later in the game, but he's a guy who is. Yeah, he threw a few interceptions. He threw a bad interception, but generally he makes very, very smart decisions on whether to run or pass. And, he doesn't look to run first. He's a guy who can stand in the pocket. He feels pressure and doesn't overreact to pressure, and that's a big attribute for the NFL. And when he's pressured, he can step up in the pocket. He can move the pocket. He keeps his eyes downfield. So I think he has a lot of traits that will translate well to the NFL. You worry about a guy he's already had an ACL injury. He struggled to stay healthy last year. It takes a lot of hits, 207 rushes this year, over 20 rushes each of the last 4 games. That's stuff you worry about for long-term durability, things like that. But I think he's well on his way to a promising NFL career.
Matt, I wondered if you had a good view of the way that Jaron Kearse performed, because he's a player that gets a lot of publicity because he's kind of got the frame of a modern NFL safety, and a lot of people are looking for sort of the next Cam Chancellor or somebody like that. But every time that I've watched him this year, I've been left really disappointed, and sort of my lasting impression of him in this game was either trailing Derrick Henry on the big run that he had on Alabama's first score, couldn't make the tackle, couldn't keep up with him, and then trailing O.J. Graham, the tight end, on a similar big play as well. So, from maybe in the press box, did you get a good view of how he performed overall, being able to see the whole field?
Honestly, I'd have to. I'm going to watch the game again. I'd have to see it again to look closely at things like that. But I think for sure it was kind of a disappointing game for Clemson safeties. I mean, both Kearse and T.J. Green, who announced his intention to enter the NFL draft. Clemson had very, very good pass defense all year. They had obviously a great pass rush. And Mackenzie Alexander is a guy I've loved, who is a terrific player. And Clemson had to play most of the game without him at corner because he had a hamstring injury. But yeah, I mean, I can't give a lot of specifics on Kearse from this game. I have to rewatch the game. But there were blown cover. O.J. Howard is an athletic, talented tight end who probably is going to have a promising pro career, but he had 200 yards because Clemson blew coverages, and I'd have to look again to see what exactly went wrong. I know Green was out of position at one point. Kearse is a guy who's been kind of up and down his whole career. He's an intriguing guy because he's 6'5", 220. I mean, he's this just enormous safety, and he had his best year overall at Clemson, but he's still an inconsistent guy who can be out of position, can miss tackles, and we saw that for sure against Alabama. So he's going to be a bit of a project. I think teams are going to love his potential, and I think that potential is certainly there. But he's not the type of guy who's going to be a sure thing coming into the NFL or close to a sure thing. So I think there's still a lot to prove for him for sure.
We got the end here of the season. Obviously, we got the whole season in 2015 college football. I mean, Alabama and Clemson both finished 14-1. 14. I mean, didn't teams used to win the national championship like at 10-0? But
pretty much, yeah.
So we've got a lot more data. I guess that is a good thing for draft analysts. You get a lot more data to work with these players. Now that the whole season is complete, what were like maybe 1 or 2 takeaways? Something that you saw this year from a player that is entering the draft, maybe a guy that really surprised you with how much his stock has risen, a guy that you started to fall in love with watching him this year, and maybe a guy who went in the opposite direction that had a really disappointing season that maybe you no longer would not necessarily take on your team in the first couple rounds?
Well, to start with the positives, it's a shame to say because I'm like devastated by the injury. But Jalen Smith from Notre Dame, the linebacker, I really hope he returns healthy. He, suffered a knee injury it tore his ACL and MCL in the Fiesta Bowl.
Yeah, awful looking.
He's such a phenomenal player, such a great athlete. He had a brilliant season for Notre Dame, whose defense was still kind of mediocre, but got better this year than last year. And he's just a guy who has terrific instincts in pass coverage, can make plays in the backfield, great in pursuit, just so athletic, instinctive. Thankfully now, players tend to rebound more quickly from injuries, but he's the type of guy who I think somebody could steal him if he slips a little bit in the draft because of that injury, because he's a guy, if he gets back healthy, he's a top 10 caliber player. And, I kind of expected that coming into the season, but I think he's a guy who keeps raising expectations, and I think had a phenomenal season. One of the guys, obviously everybody's going to want to talk about the quarterbacks, and I'm very curious to see what happens with Paxton Lynch, because he's a guy whose stock went through the roof during the season, and he had some terrific games. He played maybe his best game against Ole Miss in Memphis' biggest game of the season, where they beat Ole Miss at home, which is one of the biggest wins Memphis has ever had. And Lynch played a really, really good game in that game. So I was impressed with him. I would definitely have him as one of my top quarterbacks, but obviously he also had his worst game to end it. He was dreadful in the Auburn game, averaged under 3 yards per attempt in the Birmingham Bowl. Kind of guy who's going to be up and down and going to be polarizing, which I think is the case with pretty much this entire quarterback class. I think the other time I was on the podcast with you guys, we talked about Christian Hackenberg. Polarizing is the first word that will be brought up with Hackenberg. Even Jared Goff, who I think is the best quarterback prospect, he's still a guy who has to make a transition from the air raid system. Still a guy who has to prove how he can handle pressure and things like that, because he didn't play behind a good offensive line at all at Cal. Connor Cook, there's already been a lot of weird discussion about his leadership ability and things like that, but he's been a guy who's been streaky throughout his college career. So I think the quarterbacks are going to be fascinating because there's no slam dunks.
Yeah.
And the other guy who I think is going to be fascinating to talk about is Derrick Henry. Because I'm not sold on him as an NFL prospect, as a top guy. I think Ezekiel Elliott is the clear number one running back, and I don't think it's a debate. Henry he has some speed, he has some power, but I don't think he's a guy who can create by himself, and he's going to need a great offensive line, I think. And standing around him when you go to these events, it's just insane how big he is. He's 6'3", 242. He looks even bigger than that. I don't know if you guys saw the picture on Twitter.
Can you imagine him,
being Mark Ingram? But yeah.
Can you imagine if the Seahawks had Derrick Henry and you had your quarterback standing next to your running back? Rob, you're a huge fan of Jalen Smith. Obviously, the injury was devastating, but he went right up your boards, and I know that you did not care necessarily for Christian Hackenberg or Connor Cook. Any thoughts there on Matt's thoughts on those guys, as well as Derrick Henry?
Well, I think that Matt's absolutely right. I completely agree with everything that Matt said about Derrick Henry. And, how many NFL running backs are the size of Derrick Henry? I mean, it's such a rare thing. And the big thing about him is he is huge, but it seems to be a lot in his upper body. And he has long legs, and it provides a really big target. So what you tend to find is that if the Alabama offensive line and his big sort of touchdown to open the scoring in the game, in the national championship game, there was a lane that one of us three could have run through there. I mean, it was enormous. And if he gets that, he can make a nice cut, he can go, and he's got the speed to finish. But if you get to him in the backfield and you get a glancing blow on his frame, he loses balance and he's down. He doesn't break tackles. He doesn't really push the pile. You sort of see him and expect that he's going to be this like Marshawn Lynch, beasting through tackles and breaking tackles and pushing the pile, and you just don't see it. So a team that maybe sort of values a one-cut runner who can get into the second level and then finish might consider him, but I just think that if anybody thinks he's going to go in the first round, I just can't see it. And I think that a lot of teams are going to have to debate whether the second round is a bit too early for a running back like that. And you've got someone like Ezekiel Elliott who's just makes things happen in so many different ways. He's a great catcher out the backfield, blocks brilliantly. has got the home run hitting speed. He does sort of break tackles, and he does get the extra 2 or 3 yards when he takes contact. So when you've got somebody like that sitting there, it's not going to help Derrick Henry. As for sort of the other players, Jalen Smith, such a good player. I mean, it's not as bad an injury as it could have been. It could have been a lot worse. I don't think it's as bad as Nick Chubb's, even though it looked as serious when it happened. But I think that teams are going to look at him and say, look, if Todd Gurley can go in the top 10, then there's a chance that Jalen Smith's still going to go in that range, because you can kind of wait him out, get him recovered, and on the other side of this injury, you're going to be left with a really good player.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of interesting prospects out there. Matt, now that we've got these games today for the Seahawks with the Panthers, are you at all surprised with the sort of the level that Cam Newton has gone to this year after watching him? His first 4 years in the NFL after coming out of Auburn were very good, but certainly he's taken it to another height. And how do you sort of measure up Cam Newton versus Russell Wilson as pro prospects today?
I don't know if I'm surprised. I guess, the way his career trajectory was happening, I didn't know. I guess it's a little bit of a surprise that he kind of took off the way he did this year, and obviously the way the Panthers played this year kind of surprised everybody. But hey, I love it because there's probably no football player in the NFL that I enjoy watching more than Cam Newton. I think the way he's performed with just questionable receiving core too. The Panthers don't have a lot of talent in receiver, and they're playing with like cast-offs, and the way he's made Greg Olsen into like a superstar, and it's.
What did you think of Devin Funchess?
I wasn't completely sold on him just because he had a weird career at Michigan where he didn't have a great final season, and they moved him a receiver, but that offense was such a mess at Michigan that it was kind of hard to judge. And he was a very, very talented guy, and they weren't sure how to use him really, it seemed at times, and they weren't sure what to do at quarterback either. So with the right coaching and with the right quarterback, not a surprise if he takes off and has a good career. I love this matchup. Obviously, it's two guys who I love seeing as a college first guy. I love seeing guys like Newton and Wilson who can run read option and run a lot and can do college-type things. I love seeing them succeed in the NFL just as a guy who likes to see that happen, and a guy who wanted Chip Kelly to succeed for the same reason. And so I love this matchup of quarterbacks, and I think it just anytime you can provide a different dimension that kind of upsets the balance in the NFL of the old-school mentality that most coaches have, I love to see that.
Yeah, there are a lot of other guys, because we talked about Deshaun Watson. Are there some other guys that you like from maybe freshmen, sophomores, maybe guys that haven't gotten as much attention, maybe smaller school guys, the way that Colin Kaepernick was? Are there some other guys out there that we should be keeping an eye out that could run a read option?
That's a good question. I'll have to think about that. Well, J.T. Barrett from Ohio State is going to be one of the best quarterbacks returning next year. I'm going to be interested to see how he develops as a pro prospect because he's a bit smaller, and he had a lackluster season this year. This season for Ohio State was just so weird because they didn't know what to do at quarterback, and they ended up benching Cardale Jones for J.T. Barrett, and Barrett finished 5th for the Heisman as a redshirt freshman when he wasn't even expected to play, and when Braxton Miller got hurt and he took the job. And then this year he's coming off his injury, and he doesn't get the starting job. And then the second half of the year they just didn't really know what to do with the passing game. But with a full off season where he's the guy, there's no more quarterback debate. Barrett's the guy for Ohio State next year, where they're kind of rebuilding. They lose just an insane amount of talent, but it's clear that it is Barrett's team. They really like him as a leader. They really like him as a runner. He's very, very smart with his decision making in the read option. He allowed Ohio State to push the tempo. He can do things like that, and he probably has a little bit of Russell Wilson in him. I mean, as a redshirt freshman, he was a very efficient passer. He doesn't have a huge arm, but he can make plays as kind of a timing and rhythm passer. And when you add the read option, I think he could kind of, after this forgettable season, forgettable, they still finished 13 or 12-1 and won the Fiesta Bowl, but forgettable based on their standards and their expectations. I think he can kind of rebound next year and be a Heisman candidate. So I'm very interested to see I don't know what he's going to be as an NFL prospect. I don't know if he's going to be a great NFL prospect, but I'm curious to see him and if he can take a next step forward again after kind of just a strange sophomore season.
Yeah, it is interesting in the NFL right now. There's 8 teams left. 3 of them run a read option pretty heavily, being Seattle, Carolina, and Kansas City. Rob, how do you think that changes the college game and the way that players are developed when you have so many quarterbacks where it is important that you can be a threat to run?
Well, I think that one of the major changes that has happened in the NFL, and it's really sort of been inspired by the way that college has gone. A lot of the top recruits in high school are choosing, or the best athletes are choosing to play defense, and we're kind of seeing that progress to the college ranks. We're seeing guys. I think Cam Irving was perhaps the most high-profile case of this. That sort of there are so many players great athletes wanting to play defense now. The teams are now encouraging them to convert back to the offensive line or something like that. So you see this great influx of talent and athleticism coming into defense, and it's starting to show in the NFL level. The defensive linemen in the league are so much better, it seems, than offensive linemen. You look in the NFL's top 100 players from last season, I think there was maybe 3 or 4 offensive tackles in the whole list, and many, many more defensive linemen in there, and there's this huge mismatch going on. So what you kind of need in the NFL now is somebody who can avoid pressure, keep plays alive, and create. And it's also helped that quarterbacks like Russell Wilson, until recently Colin Kaepernick and Cam Newton and others are having a lot of success now. The fact that someone like Russell Wilson and Cam Newton are sort of up there in terms of being in sort of the MVP conversation and sort of leading their teams and doing all the things that you otherwise wouldn't expect them to do. For many years, Marshawn Lynch was kind of the identity of Seattle, and now it seems to be Russell Wilson on offense. They're getting up to the level of the Brees and the Brady and the Rodgers, and it shows that they can get there, even if they are, quote unquote, running quarterbacks. So, it's something that teams have to look at. I think we're going to see less and less. I remember when Ryan Mallett came out, and there was a time, obviously his character put paid to that, but he would have in previous years been, quite a highly respected talent as someone who was a complete statue in the pocket, but just had a big arm and would throw it downfield, and that is kind of what the NFL was looking for. And I sense now what they're looking for is somebody that can at least keep plays alive, is mobile, and we're sort of seeing that. The top 2 quarterbacks who went in the last draft, Jameis Winston obviously is not a huge ring quarterback, but he is pretty mobile and shifty, and he can avoid pressure. Marcus Mariota, obviously very athletic. Blake Bortles went very early, and he had some escapability to him, even though he kind of ran in the 4.8s to the 4.9s. He could still avoid pressure and keep plays alive. And teams are definitely looking for that now.
I mean, I know me personally, when I hear stuff like that, I mean, if I was 17 years old, I mean, I'm 6'6", I'm a big guy. I'm a 6'6", 225 pounds. If I was hearing that, what I would want to think is, yeah, get sacks. But on the other hand, I'm thinking, make that money. And I would want to go play on the offensive side where there's a deficiency, because I'm looking over at Breno Giacomini or James Carpenter getting paid. And I'm like, I just want to get paid, because they can go out and find a Willie Young off the street to play defensive end. So I could see the sense now in which maybe things start to shift if coaches or advisors are being like, hey, man, we actually need a great left tackle or a right guard, so I think I can get you more money if you come to that side. So everything sort of seems to shift one way or the other, but as far as quarterbacks go, I think that you're seeing how much more of a threat you can be. Another thing that is interesting with the coaching searches in the NFL, 2 jobs have been taken with Adam Gase going to the Dolphins and Hugh Jackson going to the Browns. There's other jobs available like the San Francisco 49ers, and that could be another read option case for a team if they decide to keep Colin Kaepernick. One of the guys, obviously, they're looking at, Mike Shanahan, sort of helped usher in the read option with Robert Griffin in 2012, so you could see more of that. But Matt, why do you think that? Because I haven't heard a lot of college names being floated around right now. I hear a lot of coordinators and a lot of old coaches being floated around, like a Tom Coughlin. Why would you go for a Tom Coughlin instead of a Kevin Sumlin? It seems like even though there's been success with Carroll and Harbaugh, somewhat with Chip Kelly, as you mentioned, that he was brought in and he had some success. Why do you think that those college names aren't being floated around, or do you think that we'll come back to that? Is it just not a good year on the landscape of college football?
Well, honestly, some of the names that have been brought up, like Sumlin, I don't know why anybody would hire Kevin Sumlin right now. I mean, Texas A&M is really taking a turn for the worse, and they just had to fire their offensive coordinator. They just lost 2 5-star quarterbacks, just transferred back to back. And, Sumlin is primarily known as a recruiter, which has always made the NFL connection a little bit weird. And now he's had trouble managing the talent he has and, making promises to people, and it ends up not working out. And someone's a guy who's going to end up being on the hot seat at the college level next year, whereas, a year or two ago, we were talking about him for NFL jobs, talking about him for the USC job, and suddenly the conversation has really changed about him, just as it's really changed about Gus Malzahn at Auburn, too, where he's gone from, superstar to, wait a second, is he actually good? I mean, they would go 7-6 this year. Their offense was a mess. The guy I thought would be on the NFL radar this year, and maybe he still will be, is Brian Kelly from Notre Dame. And I think he should be near the top of the list if anybody's looking to the college level. He's did a terrific coaching job this year. Notre Dame, for the second year in a row, just had a ton of injuries, but they were well built on the lines, especially the offensive line. It kind of allowed them to transition between quarterbacks unexpectedly, transition between running backs unexpectedly. And I think he's the type of guy who could work in an NFL environment. I think when something like Chip Kelly happens, and for all of Kelly's faults, I mean, it's not like he was awful as a head coach. The personnel stuff totally backfired, clearly.
Mm-hmm.
But he still had 2 10-win seasons. But despite that, I think when something like this happens, NFL decision makers tend to be pretty conservative with this stuff and risk averse. And when making an aggressive hire like Kelly backfires, I think NFL GMs or owners kind of get terrified of having the same thing happen to them.
Any college coaches of note that you feel are anxious to get an NFL job and maybe really like they're at their job now, and like a Jim Mora maybe or something like that, where they're just like, okay, yeah, I'm smiling now, but I just want to get back to the pros.
Yeah, I think Mora is one who's just always kind of in that mix where there's questions about him at UCLA and whether or not they're ever going to actually get over the hump. Right now, he's got the next big thing at quarterback, Josh Rosen, who we could be talking about as the number 1 pick in the draft in 2018. Mora should hopefully be able to, work with Rosen to try to get to the next step and be a top 10 team and maybe win a Pac-12 title. But he's a guy, who always seems to have possibly a wandering eye, who I expect to be back in the NFL. And I think Brian Kelly from Notre Dame, too. I think Notre Dame is a job that wears on you. The politics involved in that job, the expectations involved in that job, the different academic standards they have to deal with. It's just a lot of things you have to deal with as a Notre Dame head coach. And obviously you have to deal with a lot of things as an NFL head coach, too. But one of the reasons Bill O'Brien wanted to get out from Penn State to the NFL quickly was obviously there's a ton of pressure when you're an NFL head coach, but you're mostly just dealing with football. With college, you got to deal with all this other nonsense that some of these guys would see it as, with recruiting, with dealing with boosters, and dealing with all the politics that are involved that are extra to the actual just coaching football. And that's why I don't think Chip Kelly's in a rush to get back to college. Chip Kelly hates recruiting, and I think Kelly's a guy who, from what I've heard a little bit, is a guy who will jump at an NFL opportunity if the right one comes. Brian Kelly.
Yeah. I'll ask one more question, then I'll open the floor to Rob to ask you one more question. I'll give him a second to think about that. But I personally, I'm a Washington State alum, and this year I've managed to recruit Rob to be a Cougs fan. They don't have college football, as far as I'm aware, in the UK, so he had no prior affiliate. He just liked to watch the game. But now he's full on with the air raid offense. The Cougs were ranked for a minute this year for the first time in a long time. They won a game as a ranked team. They fell a 44-yard field goal of upsetting Stanford, which would have changed their whole landscape of the season for both teams. It didn't work out, but still, there's so much more promise coming forth, it would seem, and Luke Falk next year. Just kind of curious what your thoughts are for the Cougs next season. Would they be in your top 25 going into the year, and what sort of thing do you expect them maybe to compete for the Pac-12?
Yeah, I don't think there's any reason not to be optimistic with the direction they're headed now. It was a weird season where, everybody was kind of bailing when they lost to Portland State in the opener, but, Luke Falk came on and turned out to be a perfect Mike Leach quarterback. And he was only a sophomore and just had a fantastic season, really. And, they get a lot coming back, and I think the Pac-12 is going to be kind of wide open next year. I mean, I am actually, when we are done recording this podcast, I am going to get back to working on my 2016 early rankings, which will be up on Sports on Earth on Thursday. And I think Washington State will be a borderline top 25 team. I haven't made final decisions yet, but I think they're right in that mix. It's going to be interesting to follow because the Apple Cup next year should be very, very good because Washington is also on the rise with some young talent that they have with Jake Browning at quarterback, Myles Gaskin at running back, two guys who were freshmen this year. So that I guess that hurts Washington State a little bit that Washington might also be on the rise under Chris Peterson. But I think it's a wide open league next year that should be good, but not necessarily with a clear dominant team. I know Christian McCaffrey's back at Stanford, but they lose a lot elsewhere. Oregon's doing another FCS transfer at quarterback. USC will have talent. UCLA will have talent. But it's going to be a wide open league, and I think there's an opportunity for Washington State to win some games where they have probably the most proven quarterback coming back, and Leach finally has some momentum. Their defense got better this year. I think it's finally time to be optimistic, which we haven't been able to say that about Washington State for 10 years.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And it's been, if I could start my pitch to you to pick Washington State over Washington, Matt, we're colleagues. We've been together on Sports on Earth for a whole year now. So I think, definitely just remember Mike Leach and Luke Falk and Gabe Marks.
Chris Peterson's pretty good, too.
Yeah, but, those guys get plenty enough. They've had their time and a little overrated. So, and that whole Apple Cup, by the way, no Luke Falk, give me a break. I mean, that Apple Cup doesn't count. I'm going to hand it over to Rob. Rob, you got one more question here for Matt about anything from college football to the draft or the pros.
Well, just we started off talking about the big game on Monday, and I kind of want to finish there as well. One of the things that I'm having a trouble working out is trying to judge the Alabama defensive line. So, you've got Robinson in there who's had a lot of publicity. Reed next to him, people are talking about them as being potential first-round picks. You've got Allen in there too. A lot of people seem to like him. And yet the one guy that, I've watched this year and has kind of impressed me more than those guys is DJ Petway, and I thought he had a really good game again on Monday. I don't think he's somebody the Seahawks would consider, by the way, because I'm not sure he's quite got the length, but I could easily see him, playing for the Ravens or somebody like that. But when you look at that sort of defensive front, Matt, do you just see a collection of really good run blockers, or do you see guys who could be more than that? Because I'm not entirely sure whether the NFL is going to rush to draft, pure run blockers in the first round, because you generally can find those guys in the veteran free agent market or in the later rounds.
Yeah, you make a good point that it's hard to sort out this line and this whole defense. I mean, they were just so ridiculously deep. I mean, I mentioned this in my column the other day. There was one of the biggest defensive plays of the game. Alabama had a big sack of Deshaun Watson in the fourth quarter, and it was by Deshaun Hand, who's a third-string defensive end who happened to be the number one overall recruit in the country last year. I mean, that's their third-string defensive end, and that's the kind of depth Alabama has. And all these guys are enormous. All of them look like NFL players. I mean, all of their line, pretty much, except for Jonathan Allen's, over 300. All of their linebackers are over 240. I've always loved Ashawn Robinson's athleticism. I think he's a guy who can, if you look at that defense, they're not. Alabama rarely has had great pass rushers. I mean, they don't put up a lot of individual stats, although this year was kind of their best year where Jonathan Allen had a great year. He had over 10 sacks. And the guy who really stepped up, who's I think the most intriguing guy to watch as well is Tim Williams, who stepped up as an outside linebacker, defensive end, kind of a rush end guy, had 19 tackles coming into the national championship, and 10 and a half of those were sacks. And this is kind of unusual for Alabama because Alabama had not had a player with over 10 sacks since 2007. And Allen and Williams both had over 10 this year. And, it was easy to kind of get lost in the shuffle, but Williams stepped up as kind of an intriguing pass rushing option who I think is a guy who's a great athlete who's going to probably, have a big combine and all that and kind of rise up boards. But it's hard to judge because a lot of these guys were situational players because they just had so many bodies that they could rotate in. I think Ashawn Robinson and Jerron Reed are both first-round types who are just 300-pounders who are outstanding athletes who are great against the run. But maybe they're probably playing in 3-4s in the NFL. But I'm going to be very interested to see how it sorts itself out for sure, and to see who the NFL values the most. Just because there's just so much talent across the board. Reggie Ragland is probably a sure thing as a linebacker stepping in. Reuben Foster is a guy who kind of just plays at 1,000 miles an hour as a hard hitter at linebacker as well. Probably going to come to the pros. And this is the type of defense that the 2011 LSU-Alabama games, when they had a rematch in the title game, there was just, and if you look back now, there's just an insane number of players. Basically, everybody from those defenses played in the NFL. And we're probably going to be talking about the Alabama defense in the same way. It's just kind of a ridiculous amount of wealth. Where I don't know, there's probably not a guy who's going to be a top 5 pick, but it's just a lot of guys who are going to be looked at in the second half of the first round, in the second round, in the third round. And it's not hard to see why Alabama was playing for the national championship and won the national championship.
Well, Matt, you're a top 5 pick of mine, so take that for what it's worth. 3000 NFL Mock Draft. Follow Matt Brown on Twitter at MattBrownCFB, and look for him on SportsOnEarth.com with those top 25 rankings coming out soon. And he has assured me that the Cougs will be in it. So he hasn't assured me, but he'll think about it and he'll know what's right.
I'm doing more than just the top 25, so they'll be on there somewhere.
Well, we want for whatever reason someone at some point made a magic number, and that magic number is all that matters to anyone at this point. But thank you again for joining us, Matt, and giving us your time and insight into the national championship and everything else.
You got it. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Matt.
All right, that's Matt Brown. Follow again on Twitter at MattBrownCFB. And there we are through the first part of this show today with our talk about the national championship, because we did start this whole thing talking about and centering it around college football. We started 1 week before the first game of the season. And Rob, did you think we'd make it to this far?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I can't believe how quickly it's gone. I mean, I remember we did a podcast when I was in France one week, and I think that was just after Seattle lost to Green Bay, and then we've kind of gone through the year. I've moved house since we started doing the podcasts as well. So a lot has happened in the last few months, and here we are. So it's the end of the college season now, and hopefully it's not going to be the end. It was nearly the end of Seattle season as well this week. So. We would be really talking about the draft this week if it wasn't for Blair Walsh. So maybe we should take a moment to thank him.
Yeah, I'm not ready. I'm not ready to talk about the draft as it pertains to the Seahawks position. And that game. I mean, first of all, A+ segue, Rob, on the Seahawks there. But yeah, I mean, what's interesting is when you look at that kick. So Minnesota Vikings obviously lose 10-9. The Seahawks win. A lot of people calling the Seahawks lucky, and I don't use the term lucky. I use the term fortunate. They weren't lucky to put themselves in a position to be leading at the end of the game. You put yourself in that position through whatever it is. You put yourself in that position by holding a team to 3 field goals. You put yourself in that position by stripping the ball out of Adrian Peterson's arms. He didn't fumble the ball. He was stripped by Cam Chancellor. So I think that they put themselves in that position. They were fortunate that Blair Walsh missed the kick. But even still, the kick before, they replayed it many times. Richard Sherman came within a fraction of a centimeter of getting his hand on the ball at least, and an inch away from just outright blocking it. The next kick goes to the left. Now, do you call that a coincidence? I was rewatching the Seahawks-Panthers game, and Graham Gano, after they scored a touchdown to make it 23-20, Graham Gano missed the extra point. It went wide to the left. Richard Sherman came within a fraction of an inch of blocking it. They've got something going on with Richard Sherman on the edge. How would you diagnose the kick, the final play, the final drive? What were your thoughts?
Well, I too watched the Carolina game again today from week 6, and I just thought, what a bizarre game. I'm sure we'll come on to that in a moment, but it was weird because I thought the whole Minnesota game, Kenny, and I'm guessing there was a lot of people who felt this way. I kind of resigned myself at some point in the third quarter that I just didn't think Seattle were going to win the game. It had all the makings of a Seahawks loss. The fact that they'd created some errors and not been able to force mistakes on the other side of the ball. Minnesota had played virtually error-free, and that was sort of the difference. And because of the cold, there weren't any huge sort of big plays that were going on for either team. And when it got to 9-0, I found it hard to imagine, because the Seahawks hadn't scored a point at that point.
Yeah.
They were going to get a touchdown to get them back in it. And then, of all the plays to sort of get them back into it, that bizarre botch snap and then throwing it downfield, and then they get to 10-9 up. And I've gone from, thinking there's no chance they're going to win this game to then all of a sudden believing that they were going to win the game.
I mean, how many times have we been through that feeling in the last 4 years? I remember 2012 against the Patriots. That's the one that I always go back to. Is I remember all the people on Twitter. Can't even believe I've been on Twitter since 2012. But all the people on Twitter, just like, oh, the Seahawks, they're not that good. And these are Seattle fans being like, through the 3 quarters they were losing by whatever it was, 13 or whatever, just like, yeah, we just can't match up with the Patriots. We're not that good. It's going to be a long season again. And then they come out and they're just like, holy, they can do it. They are doing it. And I feel like you do that against the Atlanta Falcons in the playoffs. You do that against the Green Bay Packers in the playoffs. There were so many games that the Seahawks, they really are, the Chicago Bears, that huge game in 2012 as well. There's a resiliency to the team, isn't there?
There is. And I think it's one of the great things about following this team, and it doesn't always go your way, but they make it very interesting. I think that we'll probably look back on that in whatever is the next era of Seahawks football and sort of miss that aspect about it, because it does make it really dramatic. It makes it kind of stressful as well, but it is interesting to watch. But having sort of got to the point where I believed that they were going to win and was sort of allowing myself to imagine the game against Carolina next week. There was the third down play. So I think there was the 2-minute warning, and Seattle just needed a first down essentially at that point to ice the game. Even if they went, if it was sort of 3 runs and then punt, I think they would have left Minnesota with a few seconds to drive downfield and get the field goal. At that point, you were saying just get the first down, do what you couldn't do against Carolina in week 6 and what you couldn't do against Cincinnati in week 5. And finish the game on offense. And again, they didn't manage to do it. So they put it in the hands of the defense again, which had played fantastic all day. You're still feeling pretty confident. And then just bang, 2 plays. And I went, and my wife was in the kitchen, and I just went into the kitchen and told her, we're going to lose the game in the last minute. And, I came back into the room to watch the kick. And I don't really know what I was thinking. It never crossed my mind that he was going to miss. I never for a second thought that was a possibility. I was kind of watching Richard Sherman, hoping that he was going to sort of make some play or block it again, as he nearly blocked the previous one, and never for a second contemplated the miss. And it wasn't even close. And I'm an atheist, but I was saying I don't know who I was thanking for that, but I was shouting the words "thank you" just looking up at the ceiling, because I just couldn't believe it. And I think it would have been an emotional win for a lot of people, because that was almost, it's not as significant a game as the Super Bowl, obviously, but it kind of felt like we were owed one of those, for the pain of last year. We were owed a game ending that way in favor of Seattle. And, it's done now. So I
wonder what the Packers are owed.
Yeah. Maybe we'll find out this weekend.
Maybe. Oh, God. Can you imagine a rematch of the NFC Championship, by the way? To go to Lambeau and do it over. I mean, it's all that, but that's all in the future. But yeah, the game against Minnesota, there were so many other things where, I felt sick to my stomach during the game, and you sort of, at a certain point, you go, okay, I thought we were going to win, but you know what? We lost, and I'm just going to accept that, and I'm going to think about what I'm going to do tomorrow, and that's fine, and I'll be fine, and everybody's season ends at some time. And then you win, and obviously everything changed. I mean, when you get that lead, every time they got the ball twice, and you're just like, Kristen Michael, I know it's not completely up to your responsibility to just blow us away right now. Just pick up these first downs, because it's like, again, I'm going to reference 2012 with Marshawn Lynch. They were playing the Baltimore Ravens, or it might have been 2011 actually if they were playing the Ravens, but they had to, or maybe it was 2013. Anyway, They had to know it was 2011. Okay,
It was
great.
definitely 2011, yeah.
Great, because it was 4 years ago, because it was the AFC North. But yeah, they needed to put the game away, and they had like a 7-minute drive with Marshawn Lynch just picking up first down on those third downs or whatever. That's how you kill a team and win the game. They don't have that this year. And it's not just because they didn't have Marshawn Lynch, because as you said, it didn't happen against the Carolina Panthers. Even the week before against the Cincinnati Bengals, with Thomas Rawls having a great game, it didn't happen. They don't have any of that drive-sustaining killer anything going on. And when you rewatch some of the games, and I haven't rewatched the Vikings game, but watching the Panthers games, in retrospect, maybe it's hindsight, but when it's like you've got 2:55 left and you can't get a first down and you're throwing it and you can't complete a pass, and now you're not even killing clock, and your runs aren't in the right spots or going in the right places. I'm not a Darrell Bevell hater, and I don't think that Darrell Bevell is a bad offensive coordinator. I think he's a great offensive coordinator, but there is something going on that's incorrect, and that's definitely what happened against the Vikings, and they almost cost them their season, that they put themselves in a position to give Teddy Bridgewater 3 opportunities to win the game, and I don't care who the quarterback is, if he's in a position at home to get 3 chances and really to just go 40 yards or whatever, you can't give anybody that many opportunities. It's like in baseball where you just keep on having errors. You just can't have that many errors, and it doesn't matter who you're facing. They're going to score runs. So that's the sort of thing that if you're going up against Carolina again this week and they've got to be able to move the ball, I think Marshawn Lynch is going to play. How well he looks, it's so much different. How did you think that Kristen Michael did overall against the Vikings? And having just watched Marshawn Lynch against the Panthers in the replay and sort of seeing how his body and his ability looked this year, what do you think is the difference, and how much of a difference that would play on Sunday?
Before I answer that, do you know the one thing I was thinking when they got the 3rd and 5, because like I said, there was the sort of 2-minute warning, so you had a sort of a lot of time to dwell on it. I was thinking, please just find Doug Baldwin on a little crossing route. Maybe he could just take it 80 yards again, like he did in Pittsburgh, because that would just make things very, satisfying there. Just to that was kind of like the extreme success of like a 3rd down conversion. They needed it to ice the game against Pittsburgh, and he goes and takes it 80 yards for a touchdown. So it didn't happen. They won the game. As for Michael, I thought he played fairly well, and I think there's a danger of kind of overrating how he played, because he just didn't fumble the ball, and people sort of expect the worst from him, I suspect, because he had the reputation of being technically poor and running with in one arm all the time and not being able to switch arms depending on what side of the field he's at. His vision still, for me, is a little bit suspect. I think one of the great things, underrated things about Thomas Rawls is he kind of senses where the gap's going to be and sort of gravitates to the right area of the field to break off a big run. And I think Kristen Michael's still struggling to do that. He will turn away. There were a couple of times where I felt like he could have bounced it outside and he chose not to, and then dipped right into traffic in the middle. And you sort of think, well, that's frustrating, because once he gets outside, he's got the speed to sort of make a big play. But on the other hand, it was horrible conditions. He gained more yards than Adrian Peterson. He didn't turn the ball over. He did a pretty solid job. And that is really, I think, all people would have hoped for him. If Marshawn Lynch doesn't play in this game against Carolina, he's going to have to be maybe a little bit better than just solid in this game. Because watching the Carolina game back, Lynch had a couple of decent runs against Carolina, but for the most part, they tried to take away the running game and then put it on Russell Wilson. They did a pretty good job sort of moving him out of the pocket and getting him on the run. So it's going to be a real test against what is a pretty good, it's not a fantastic defensive line for Carolina, but it's a pretty good one. And they have the one thing that troubles me most about Seattle, and that is a great interior pass rusher. We've seen what Aaron Donald can do. Mm-hmm. Kawan Shaw is, a very, very productive interior rusher, and they're going to have to do something to stop him and slow him down in this game.
Do you think that, with Kristen Michael and Marshawn Lynch, you say Marshawn Lynch had a couple decent runs. He had that one run where he carries the pile 5 yards, and it's like you do sort of remember what's so great and so Hall of Famey about Marshawn Lynch. And will that show up this week if he plays? I don't know, obviously. there probably is some sort of benefit to having a running back that's 29 years old that hasn't played in 2.5 months or whatever. There could be something there, or maybe he loses his mind and fumbles it. There's a lot of ways that could go. For what it's worth, Kristen Michaels, 4 games with Seattle now, 60 carries, 262 yards, 4.36 yards per carry. Some good games, some bad games, some good carries, some bad carries. Overall, I think there's still that big play sort of potential where if you're driving, you think that it wouldn't be that surprising to see Kristen Michael have a 70-yard run against a team or something like that. There's huge play potential. But as far as you're talking about Kawan Short, that's another thing that I recognized and you recognized, of course, in that game against Carolina is Kawan Short is constantly in the backfield. He got 1 or 2 sacks. They really disrupted the offensive line. And as you said, they faced Aaron Donald twice and lost twice. They faced Geno Atkins. They lost to the Cincinnati Bengals. Do you think that defensive tackle is their bugaboo? Do you think that defensive tackle, if you have an elite defensive tackle, that's going to completely screw up the offense? Is that the key?
Yeah, I think that it's pretty much there. I mean, you could go as far as saying that. I think one of the big things that teams try and do that have these great defensive tackles is that if they can collapse the interior and get Russell Wilson on the move and then just hold the rush off the edge, then he quite often runs into the defensive end. So the defensive ends don't rush, don't go all out to beat the tackle. They'll just hold their position. You collapse the pocket from the inside. It moves Wilson out, and then the defensive end can just read where Wilson's going to go, and it's a pretty easy sack. And the St. Louis Rams did that time and time again in Week 16, and it gave the Seahawks offense fits. Now, Kawan Short, as great as he is not Aaron Donald. So handling him, and I think they did a good job with Geno Atkins for the most part, although from what I remember, Wilson was moving around a bit. I just think that they've got to keep an eye on him. I think that Patrick Lewis actually played in the game against Carolina in Week 6, if I'm not mistaken. So there's no sort of, Drew Nowak played in that game and we'll see an improvement now. No, Patrick Lewis played in that game. So it's something they're going to have to game plan around. I think that the best thing for Seattle to do is to keep that pocket clean. If they do that, Wilson is going to be able to sort of spray the ball around like he did in Week 17 against Arizona. And he's going to be very, very difficult to stop, especially against the secondary, which is it's incredibly weakened since the Week 6 game. And although Josh Norman is great, they've got a few key injuries there. And Seattle has won for the last 3 visits to Carolina. And watching this game, Kenny, I don't know what you thought. I rewatched at the time. I couldn't believe that Seattle lost. And rewatching it, I cannot believe that Seattle lost. It is one of the weirdest games, I think, involving the Seahawks in the Carroll era, because Carolina didn't do anything in the game, and they essentially had, I think, 3 or 4 80-yard drives, and everything else was awful.
It was, as I think is the case more than once this year. It was opportunities, and it was the opportunities that Seattle didn't get, and it was the ones where Cam Newton threw 2 interceptions in the game. One of them was a straight pick. I mean, it was a great play by Earl Thomas to get in there and just jump the route and get the interception. The other one was a tip pass, but there were 3 other balls that should have been intercepted. I mean, he could have had 5 interceptions in that game. There was a fumble in that game. Bruce Irvin sacked Cam Newton twice. They were always on Cam Newton constantly throughout the game. It was Jimmy Graham's best games. Obviously, he's not going to be there, but I don't even know if necessarily, as we say, have been saying, if the absence of Jimmy Graham is a bad thing, because just because he had 8 catches for 140 yards, what they've done to adjust in his absence has made them a more prolific offense. And I still want Jimmy Graham to come back next year, and I want them to figure out how to make it even more prolific with him now that they've seen 2 sides of the same coin. But I think that there is plenty there where if you watch the game, you say, if you had just done this one thing, you would have won. The freak defensive miscommunication between Earl Thomas and Richard Sherman that gave up the touchdown to Greg Olsen. How many times in 4 years have we ever seen those 2 guys miscommunicate? It didn't make any sense at the time. Kerry Williams obviously had a bad game, and I want to put all the blame on him. And it's sort of a lot more blame on him goes in retrospect and in your memory of the game than when you actually watch it. He did give up some key first downs, but really overall it was, I think, opportunities lost. I do think that Seattle outplayed Carolina for most of the game. I also sort of live by the idea that you don't outplay someone that you lose to. I just feel like at the end of the day, the score is the score. So the Seahawks got beat. I just felt like they should have done other things to win the game that they did not do. But defensively, it was a lot to be encouraged by the way that they were able to play Cam Newton. How did you feel about the way that the defensive line sort of had their way with Jonathan Stewart for most of the game and were constantly pressuring Cam Newton?
Well, I thought it was a really encouraging sort of first three quarters, and it's just sort of at the end. I mean, I couldn't believe what I was watching, Kenny. I mean, watching it back the second time, they were 23-14 up with 8 minutes to go in the game. And, suddenly everything just started to work for Cam Newton. It seemed like he was just sort of he was sort of leaning back off his back foot, throwing it as hard as he can. And every single pass was coming off. He was finding guys in these little slant routes or little post routes that were coming over the middle. And every single one worked. And every single throw to Greg Olsen worked. And it was bizarre to watch. But there's a great guy used to write for Seahawks Draft Blog a while ago called Kip Earlywine. It's and he sort of broke down the game. And I wanted to read a little bit of this to you, Kenny, because I thought you'd find it really fascinating. So he was sort of trying to understand, looking at the numbers, why Carolina won. So first of all, he sort of asked, was it because of Cam? Was it the way that Cam Newton played? His passer rating was 65.6 in the game. He had a low completion rate, low yards per attempt. He threw 2 picks against 1 touchdown, as you mentioned. He could have had at least a couple more interceptions. The 1 TD came on that infamous coverage breakdown. He was sacked 3 times. He only rushed for 30 yards, so it's not like he had a big 100-yard rushing game. And Devin Funchess, who had about 2 or 3 drops in the game, led the Panthers with 24 receiving yards. So passing game-wise, not great there. Was it the running game? No, it wasn't. Jonathan Stewart ran for 3.9 yards a carry. His longest carry of the game was 11 yards.
Mm-hmm.
So what is it? Is it third down? No, they were 4 of 11, 36.4% on third downs, below NFL average. What did they do? Did they get a load of penalties that went in their favor? No, they didn't. I think they had something like 1 first down by penalty is what Kip says here. 4th down, they failed on their only 4th down conversion. Essentially what they did is and this is what Kip analyzed, is they bunched their production together on a select number of drives and managed to get 20 first downs on 1st and 2nd down, which is just a complete anomaly. You just don't see teams basically, being awful in every category: passing, running, third down, not getting penalties, but having a great day on 1st and 2nd down on 3 specific drives. That just does not happen. And for it all to sort of come together, it was the perfect storm. And if Carolina played Seattle in that game 10 times, I think they'd have lost 9 times.
You watch Brock Hewitt's Chalk Talk this week, you'll see him sort of outline the importance of Cam Chancellor this week against Greg Olsen, and sort of he breaks down the 3 wide sets with Greg Olsen left alone on his own side there, and how important it will be and how often he says that play will come into account on Sunday in the game. And, Cam Chancellor has not been getting a lot of good grades. A lot of people from the fans, that is, for whatever that's worth, a lot of people already quick to turn to Kelsey McRae as the future and the present at strong safety. I'm not there yet. We are still here in the middle of the season. After the season, maybe you address contract situations and what, isn't it funny how Cam Chancellor, he does hold out before the year to get more money, and here we are at the end of the year and we're thinking about, maybe that was a good idea for him to try and get more money while he could, because I think a lot of fans are already thinking about the Kelsey McRae era, and so that'll come out into play. But for me, when I look at the Carolina Panthers, I do see how Greg Olsen could have a good game, but we've seen singular players have good games before in the NFL and against the Seahawks, and that's not enough. You got to have more than just the one, and I think that for the offensive side, you've got Richard Sherman. He can take out whichever player that he is covering, and then you've got Ted Ginn, who is, whoever's on him, it's just going to be, a lot of speed and not a lot else. And then you've got, they've got Devin Funchess and Corey Brown, and there's not a lot to be interested in with the receivers when it comes to matching them up against Seattle's superior defensive backs. Meanwhile, when I look on the other side of the ball, Josh Norman's not going to play the slot. He doesn't play the slot. He's not going to be on Doug Baldwin. That's your best receiver. That gives you a matchup problem. They've got injuries to Benny Ben-Kwari and to Charles Tillman.
Yeah.
So they're out there on their ends with their last remaining cornerbacks, guys off the street, Cortland Finnegan, and it's like you can take out maybe Tyler Lockett with Josh Norman or whatever, but I could see how Jermaine Kearse is going to be involved. That first play in that game was a long, deep pass to Jermaine Kearse. I think you're going to see them taking their shots once again, and I think they'll be more successful this time around because of the defensive backs that they have in Carolina now that are banged up, and that's where I'm sort of going with. And I think that you might see a big play from Tyler Lockett on special teams. So that's sort of where I'm leaning. I have confidence for Seattle to win this game this week. What do you think, Rob?
Well, I think they have every chance. I mean, for me, it's sort of a pick'em style game because that is what every game in Carolina between these two teams has been. And Seattle have done a great job finding the plays late in. I think every time they've been there, they've scored a late touchdown. I think in the first one in 2012, it took a fourth down stop with Carolina in the red zone to finish the game. Then the next two times it was sort of late plays. I remember the game last year which was a must win for Seattle, and they went there and the Luke Wilson touchdown won it with a few minutes to go, 13-9. Greg Olsen, I remember highlighting him last year, and I wrote a piece ahead of that game and how important it was, and saying Greg Olsen was going to be the huge, stopping him was going to be huge. Do you know that he had one catch for 16 yards in the regular season game last year, and then in the playoffs he had 4 catches for 58 yards. Now, if he has let's just take the better performance there. If he has 4 catches for 58 yards this weekend, I think the Seahawks have got a great chance of winning. If Ted Ginn is Ted Ginn going to beat the Seahawks in this game? Maybe, but I don't know. I just cannot imagine it. Seattle's got pace. They've got speed in the secondary to deal with somebody like that. Jericho Cottery, Devin Funchess, these are the guys that you're saying are going to beat the Seahawks. I think that every time that Seattle has played Carolina, they've done a great job defending the run. And while Seattle has been able to sort of accentuate their running game with Russell Wilson being a factor, I'm just looking at some of the stats here. In the playoff game last year, Marshawn Lynch had 60 yards. From memory, in the game that was this year, again, Seattle had trouble running for big yardage. Russell Wilson sort of helped that again in the game, which was in the regular season. I'm looking at this here. Marshawn Lynch had 62 yards. Again, Wilson was with 35 there. So I don't think Seattle's going to be, have a 100-yard runner, for example, who sort of takes this away. It's basically going to come down to, and I trust the defense to keep their end of the deal, keep it tight, limit the damage. Maybe they'll give up a touchdown to Cam Newton. Maybe they'll give up 14 points, 17 points. It's going to come down to Seattle's offense. What are we going to see? Are we going to see Russell Wilson in Week 17 against Arizona? Are we going to see Russell Wilson that played against Pittsburgh and Cleveland, Baltimore, and that great stretch that he's had? Or are we going to see the Seahawks offense that has just struggled a bit, whether it's the cold weather in Minnesota, whether it's Aaron Donald having an impact? Is there going to be something in this game, whether it is Kawan Short, whether it is Luke Kuechly, whether it is, I don't know, Josh Norman just doing a great job. Maybe he will move into the slot and cover Doug Baldwin, just making him think a little bit more. If they get him off the spot, maybe he gets sacked a few times early on. Maybe the pass protection's not great. If Seattle sort of toils a bit on offense, then this is going to be sort of the type of game for me that is won with 1 or 2 big plays in the fourth quarter, like every time these two teams meet. If Seattle can really sing on offense, though, and put some big points on the board, I just don't. I just cannot imagine Carolina necessarily catching up with that.
Well, we'll say, I mean, as far as Norman in the slot, from what I understand, it's maybe 3 or 4 snaps all season that he's been in that position. So he would be out of position. Maybe he's in that position. Maybe he's comfortable moving around, and they just haven't needed him in such a unique situation. Though I do think if you put your number 2 guy in your Carolina and you're down in the depth chart, if you put the number 4 or 5 guy on Tyler Lockett, it's going to hurt you. And that's probably going to hurt you more than Doug Baldwin. So I'm interested to see what happens there. You look at Football Outsiders. I know if you've been paying attention a little bit to Panthers Nation, they think that DVOA is sort of like the Seattle fans' comfort blanket, that makes us feel all better. That first of all, why do we need to feel better? Why do we need another tool to make us look better? If you go to the Super Bowl twice in 2 years and you're in the playoffs and once again you're in the final 8, why do I need something else? I would just tell you, hey, look at the scoreboard. So this is not like, I've been writing about the Seahawks since 2011, and it just so happens that since 2012, they've been one of the best teams in the NFL. I want to see anyone dispute that. When the time inevitably comes when they're not so good, I'm sure Football Outsiders and DVOA will flip on them, and then I'll use that as a reason to say why the Seahawks need to get better, just like I did earlier in the season when they had hit a low in DVOA, somewhere around like the 18th or 19th spot. So I don't know why anyone would take DVOA and just be like, oh God, let me do DVOA. Like what's wrong with that? Anyway, by DVOA defense, by the way, the Panthers ranked higher in defense on DVOA than the Seahawks, but against the number 1 receiver, the Seahawks are number 1. So that's the Richard Sherman effect. Against the number 1 receiver, the Panthers are number 3, which is the Josh Norman effect. Though this is by DVOA, and I think this is interesting. The Seahawks give up 47 yards to a number 1 receiver. The Panthers give up 74 yards to a number 1 receiver. So it's more yards, but perhaps they don't have as big of the Seahawks do have a higher DVOA, but the Panthers are number 3. So they're right there. I think they give up a lot of yards, but they don't necessarily get damaged that much for the yards. However, number 12, the Panthers are against number 2. So that's where I'm sort of seeing Lockett or Curse, whoever you want to designate as the number 2, I guess, doing some of that damage. Whereas the Seahawks 26th against the tight end. So that's where you sort of can see where Greg Olson's going to have another big game. Jimmy Graham, we said, is going to be out, but the Panthers, they were number 1 against the tight end this season, and Jimmy Graham had 140 yards. He had his best game. Luke Wilson, I guess, will probably come back this week, but what sort of impact he would have anyway, it doesn't seem to matter. If you're on offense, I guess. I mean, I think that I'm gonna obviously be picking the Seahawks to win the game. I just think that they are the better overall team, and I think that it's a tall order. I almost am glad that they didn't beat the Panthers in the regular season, because we'd still be here. We'd still be in this same position going to Carolina or whatever. Maybe they'd be going to Arizona, but we'd still have to get past Panthers in Carolina. So I'm kind of glad they didn't win the regular season game, because the regular season game didn't end up meaning anything. And it sort of gives you an opportunity to say, well, now we're not going to lose to you twice in the same season. There is something to it, and they're going to adjust to the things that they didn't do right, just like Carolina is. But it seems a little bit harder to beat a team twice in the same season, especially when the two teams are so evenly matched. So if you're offensively trying to attack the Panthers, I mean, it seems like when you rewatch the game, it seemed like the option was working pretty well. The rollouts, obviously Jimmy Graham was working well. Now that you don't have Jimmy Graham, what are you doing?
It's a great question. I like what they did with Graham that made it so successful is that when Wilson scrambled out, Graham had his best game sort of scrambling around and finding a bit of space there. And it's something that Luke Wilson does pretty well. So maybe they'll just be able to incorporate that. It's hard because Luke Kuechly is a real force in there. I mean, he just basically was spying Marshawn Lynch a lot of the time in this game. And when he was hitting Marshawn Lynch, he was stopping him. And you don't see that very often. The athleticism that they have, at linebacker was sort of having a real issue when they were trying to get, a little bit of extra pressure on Wilson. They have got a pretty decent defensive front. I just think it's a case of keep Wilson clean, let him do what he's been doing. I think Tyler Lockett, you mentioned him earlier, can have a big impact in this game. There was a couple of long, deep shots that Wilson took against Minnesota that would have been touchdowns had the game been played in Carolina. Let's see if Seattle can get the big play downfield. I think that they possibly can. And there's one other thing that I was sort of thinking about this week, Kenny, in looking ahead to this game, is that Carolina actually have been, we kind of think, well, they've gone 15-1 this year, but it didn't all start for them this year. Last year, they had a terrible run, which kind of almost eliminated them. Then they came storming back and just won the NFC South to get to the playoffs. But the year before, they were 12-4. And they got it. They were the number 2 seed behind Seattle, and they got a bye. And in the divisional round, they hosted San Francisco, who, of course, are a team that are built, or at the time, were pretty similar to Seattle with a mobile quarterback, tough defense. And San Francisco just went in there and just destroyed them. I mean, they won 23-10. It wasn't close. San Francisco were tougher. They were more efficient. They made big plays. Cam Newton couldn't do anything against them. And I'm just holding out hope that there is a possibility that the Seahawks can do exactly the same thing. That Cam Newton, as great as he's been, has not faced many teams or many defenses like Seattle. And, okay, they beat him in week 6, but that was a long time ago. This is a different Seahawks offense. This is a different Seahawks defense. It's going to be a completely different game. And I just think that if the Seahawks can go there and impose themselves and get Wilson rolling and get an early lead in this game, it might not be quite as close as some of us think. And if they can go and make that kind of a statement in Carolina, and if they can beat the Panthers this weekend, I'm not sure what's going to stop Seattle this year.
I'm just shocked. I mean, I bring up the strength of schedule stuff, and I'm just shocked at how dismissive a lot of Carolina fans are of it. It's not so much you can look at the strength of schedule stuff and still think you're going to win, and even think you're going to win by a lot. But how can you just ignore it? I mean, it's weird to me that anyone would think that if you took Alabama and put them in the MAC and they broke every record like they should and never lost a game, that's exactly what would happen. And you couldn't say that they are better than if they were just playing in the SEC. That's just, you can't not take into account your competition. The Panthers played the easiest schedule in the NFL. Did they go 15-1? Yes. They did the most that they could do. Maybe you could even argue that they should have gone 16-0 because the Falcons aren't that good of a team. So you take them out, and then you say, and not only that they played the easiest strength of schedule of defenses in the NFL. So they played the worst defenses, and yet they were 10th in yards per carry and 10th in net yards per pass attempt. Why weren't they better? When I look at a team like the New England Patriots in 2007 going 16-0, their strength of schedule that year was like 14th. I mean, that's phenomenal. I mean, why do you look at other teams like the 15-1 Green Bay Packers or the 14-2 Indianapolis Colts or the 14-2 San Diego Chargers or the 15-1 Pittsburgh Steelers? These are the teams that have won 14 or 15 games most recently. No playoff wins. The Pittsburgh Steelers were the last one. They went to the AFC Championship. They won one playoff game. Why did the Packers not? Because they played the easiest schedules. And I don't think that there is a true 15 or 16 win team. There is no team that can go out there and win 15 games in today's NFL, where the competition is usually good enough that you can only win those sorts of games when you're playing the most fortunate schedule possible, and that's what you get. And if you're going to play the Saints twice, and if you're going to play the Giants, and if you're going to put 17 touchdowns up, or 20 with rushing touchdowns, if you're going to put all those scores up against the worst defenses, don't let me not take that into account. If I was a Panthers fan, I would say, well, I still think we're going to beat you. We won all of our games. We beat you in week 6. Yeah, we didn't play a very easy schedule, but I think that even going up against a tougher schedule, we would have won, 13 games or something like that. And I still think we are better than you. And that's what I would say. But it still comes down to the fact that the Panthers, if they're going to win the Super Bowl, have to play their 3 toughest games of the season, dating all the way back to week 1. They haven't played the Arizona Cardinals. They played the Packers, but I don't think they're going to play them. But they haven't played the Arizona Cardinals. They got to play a Seahawks team that's better than they were in Week 6. And then they got to go and play an AFC team like the Kansas City Chiefs that's played better than them down the stretch, or the New England Patriots, or the Pittsburgh Steelers, or the Denver Broncos, who is the only team that definitely has a better defense than they do. So those are your toughest games. This is not Tampa Bay. This is not Atlanta. It's not the AFC South or the NFC East. So absolutely take that into account. And I think when the Seahawks and the Panthers meet, and they might have 5-game difference, it's going to even out. I think this is basically a 12-4 team versus a 12-4 team. And let's find out what happens. I don't think that the Seahawks can get blown out because they haven't been blown out in 4 years. So that's why I don't think that they can. Panthers have been blown out, last year. So I'm just more into the idea that, we've seen so many 15-1, 14-2 teams go to the playoffs. They get their 2 weeks off. Maybe they don't take the opponent as seriously because they only have 10 wins. And, and that's why I say if the Seahawks had beaten them in the regular season, Carolina's entire mindset would be different. They would be saying, oh man, we got to get this win. We got to prove that we can beat the Seahawks. Now we haven't been able to prove it. We've lost our last 5-6 games against the Seahawks. We can't prove it. We need to actually go out there and show them, and we need to get this monkey off our back. This is the team that beat us in this round last year. And now they're sitting there, and I think at least it's with a lot of the fans in the city, is they're like, we already beat them. We won 5 more games than them, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, okay, if that's your mindset, then you keep that mindset, but schedule does matter.
We have an advert for a beer over here, Kenny, it's a beer called Carlsberg. Have you ever heard of it?
Carlsberg, like with an R?
Yeah.
I think I've heard of it. Is it green with like cursive lettering?
It's green. So the advert over here is, Carlsberg don't do whatever. So in this case, Carlsberg don't do NFL schedules. But if they did, it would be the best, is essentially what the point is that they're making. And I think this is a Carlsberg schedule that Carolina has had. I mean, it is the perfect storm. I mean, imagine getting to play the NFC South as your own division.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine getting to play the NFC East, which is what they did. They played the entire NFC East.
Mm-hmm.
And on top of that, which of the AFC divisions would you like to face? The AFC South. So you've essentially got, if you could cherry pick the 3 divisions you had to play to make up the bulk of your schedule, it would be those 3. Those would be the 3 that you would select. And when you look at Seattle, I mean, they had obviously the NFC West, which is a very tough division. However bad the Rams are, they always play the Seahawks tough. I think it was a hindrance to play the Rams in the first week and the penultimate week because it was perhaps their best 2 spells of the year. Seattle had to go on the road to Minnesota and to Green Bay. They had to play the NFC North, which is certainly not easy. And in terms of the AFC, they had the AFC North, which is a pretty rock-solid division, for the most part, with the Steelers there and the Ravens, although they were injured, and Cleveland. But you've still got the Cincinnati Bengals. Now, if you flipped the 2 schedules, I would have personally expected Seattle to have won 13 or 14 games at a minimum. And I would expect Carolina to get maybe 9 or 10 wins.
Yeah.
That's you can't ignore that.
And that's what, I mean, these are the types of things that, DVOA does adjust for, but not even DVOA. It goes simple Pythagorean. I mean, by Pythag, taking the points allowed, points scored, and the strength of schedule, their expected win-loss for the Carolina Panthers is 12-4. And the Seahawks, their Pythag expected win-loss is 11.7 and 4.3. I mean, that's how close they really were in the regular season, and I think that's fair enough to just say, okay, great, this is a great rivalry between 2 great quarterbacks and 2 great defenses, and and let's find out what happens because you do play each other every year. And not only did they get to cherry pick, if they could have the 2 best opponents to pick, but the 2 worst divisions, but even the winners of the divisions last year. So Carolina wins the division at 7-8-1, which means they have to play the first place teams, and they get to play the Green Bay Packers, having their worst season ever under Aaron Rodgers, and then they
get them at home. not at Lambeau. So they get to face Green Bay at Carolina. Green Bay, a notoriously bad road team.
Yeah, and the Panthers, they go to Seattle. That is their tough game of the year, and it is a very tough game. And they went there and they won. But all other 15 games, I would argue, are cupcakes. So that is my point for sure when talking about schedule. I went on to Carolina radio today. It'll be on tomorrow, and yeah, when I brought up the schedule, it was I'm so sick of hearing about strength of schedule. You guys played the Browns, and it's like, yeah, that is one team that we played. You know, if we had played the Jaguars and the Titans and the Texans and the Saints twice, I mean, it's
and
you get the Falcons at the end of the year, and you get the Seahawks in the beginning of the year, like,
and the Eagles.
yeah, I mean, everybody was like at their worst, and not only that, I've watched games. So last night, I rewatched Seahawks Carolina today, and I felt fine about it. I thought I was going to be like, oh God, this kind of hurts, but it's like I felt fine about it because, like I said, I'm kind of fine with them losing it now, and I just saw how disrupted Cam Newton was, as well as Jonathan Stewart, and I saw how many opportunities they had to win that game. But not only that, I rewatched a game that they had against the Saints in Week 13 that was 41-38. I mean, they should have lost. I mean, there was another game that came right down to they had to barely beat the Saints with their worst defense. There was the same thing in Week 3. They almost lost to the Saints. And then I rewatched.
Which quarterback did they beat again when they beat the Saints in Week 3? It was Luke McCowan.
Yes.
And the score was 27-22.
Yes. Luke McCown, threw for 310 yards in that game. 31 of 38 for 310 yards against the Panthers defense. And the Saints had a lead in the third quarter, 16-10, and then the Saints and then the Panthers pulled away in the fourth quarter, but it was 27-22 with Luke McCown, and the Saints had a chance at that game. And then the other one I rewatched was the Green Bay Packers, which they won 37-29. And I just saw a team that, again, in all three of these games, I saw dropped interceptions. I saw opportunities everywhere. So I think that as much as Carolina fans are ready to pounce on me should the Panthers win, just don't count all your money. Nobody cares if you beat the Seahawks. If you beat the Seahawks, great. You've advanced one round. But I promise you, as someone who's seen a Super Bowl win and 2 Super Bowl losses, nobody gives a shit if you won 15 games. Just like nobody gives a shit if the Seahawks are the DVOA champions. You got to win the Super Bowl. And I'm just having a really hard time seeing a team that played such an easy schedule win 3 of their 3 hardest games in a row. But the only way that I'll be proven wrong is if you prove me wrong. So that's sort of where I stand with the Carolina Panthers.
Well, the only thing I look at it is that Carolina are going to play tough. I mean, it's not. I don't think it's going to be an easy win for Seattle for sure, because the last 3 times they've been to Carolina, it's been pretty close. I just think that if I was looking at this game, I wouldn't look at this as, wow, a 15-1 team against the Seahawks, and the Seahawks are going on the road. I would look at it just as, this is Carolina against Seattle, as it has been for the last 3 years. And whatever you were thinking about going to Carolina the last 3 years, think about it going into this game. Forget the fact that they're 15-1 this year. This is pretty much the same team. It is virtually the same team that you played on the road the last three years, and you won every game, but it was close. And it could be close again, but there's, they are not significantly better than they were the previous years. And let's just see if the Seahawks can do it again. I mean, why not? I mean, I think actually, like you say, losing that first game has maybe just given them that little bit extra to prove. And we saw what they did to Arizona in Week 17, having lost to them before. So let's see what happens here.
I mean, how many times in history could you say that a 15-1 team is hosting a 10-6 team in the playoffs, and the home team is only favored by 2.5 points, and the home team gets 3 points? So that means that, the Seahawks on a neutral field would be favored by half a point or something along those lines. That's how like these two teams, it's really just the Seahawks versus the Panthers, and it's anybody's guess who's going to win. I do feel confident that Seattle will win the game, but I felt much more confident that they would beat the Vikings. Obviously, it's going to be a little bit warmer in Carolina, so that should hopefully make a difference. I think that it will. Let's do a quick hitter on the other playoff games just for fun. The Chiefs at the Patriots. The Chiefs beat the Texans 30-0. The Chiefs in weighted DVOA are second. They've won 11 or 10 games in a row after 11 games in a row after their playoff win, and they go to the Patriots, who have lost 4 of their last 6. I've struggled to pick the Chiefs, but at the same time, I just don't want to ignore how much the data is saying that Kansas City is the best team in the AFC right now. What do you think?
Well, I thought that it was a really weird game against Houston that they won last week, and it was sort of closer than the scoreline suggests. And if Brian Hoyer doesn't have sort of the miserable game that he has, it would have been a closer game. I don't know. I think it's a real benchmark game for Kansas City. I'm not quite sure we know how good or bad they are, and if they could go to New England and win, then that is sending a message to everybody else that, they are a legitimate contender here to not just get to the Super Bowl, but maybe even win it. Because, that fair play to Andy Reid, as he's kind of like taking Kansas City on a different direction than the team he's left behind in Philadelphia. And, they're running the ball despite the fact that they've lost Jamal Charles. They're finding production out of guys. Alex Smith is doing just enough. On defense, they've got some good players, in the secondary and up front. So they create pressure, they capitalize it, they turn the ball over. So, they've got a nice mix there. And, they're one of those teams that are built, they're not identical by any stretch to sort of Seattle and Carolina, but, they've got a relatively mobile quarterback. They play a physical style. They have made a point of making defense an emphasis. And I want to see them win. I mean, I'm pretty sick of, New England beats. I'm not bothered about, if Seattle gets to the Super Bowl, I want to play somebody different. I'm not bothered about a rematch against New England. So, let's see a different AFC team in there, and why not the Chiefs?
Yeah, that would be really interesting for anyone to play the Kansas City in the Super Bowl. I think that if it's not the Seahawks, I would probably root for Kansas City to get one, and sort of it would be a good for the read option. As we said, it's one of the read option teams. And Alex Smith, what's interesting is that I was looking back on an article that I wrote in 2013 before the season. This was only 1 year of Russell Wilson, and just half of a season of Colin Kaepernick at that point. And the 49ers had chosen Kaepernick, obviously, over Alex Smith and traded him to Kansas City. And I sort of looked at the data, and I compared it to the St. Louis Rams back when they decided to choose Mark Bulger over Kurt Warner. And there were so many similarities that I thought to myself, I think this is going to be a mistake, getting rid of Alex Smith and going with Colin Kaepernick. I think it's not a mistake. It's a risk. It's definitely a risk, because Smith had done everything that you could have asked him to do. And we knew a lot more about him, and they decided to go with Kaepernick. And I said, I wouldn't be surprised if this looks a lot like the Kurt Warner situation, where he goes into another more stable situation and returns to the Super Bowl. So this just could mirror that even in one other way. On the other hand, you've got Belichick and Brady, so it's a really tough game. It's the first game of the weekend, Saturday at 1:35 p.m. Pacific, and I'm just going to go with the hot hand, so I say Kansas City. The late game, Green Bay at Arizona, we've talked about a little bit about both these teams. I think Arizona has obviously had a much better season, but Green Bay, Aaron Rodgers, did you feel like you saw any classic Aaron Rodgers last week against the Redskins?
Yeah, and I thought he returned to form, obviously, and I think it was more a case, rather than sort of seeing some great Green Bay revival, I think we just saw what the Washington team really is, and it's not very good. They started fairly brightly, looked like they were going to win the game, and then Green Bay just stepped up the pace and won it. I don't think that Green Bay is going to win this game, but I think that they have given themselves a better chance for sort of having last week. They will have a bit more confidence in themselves. I think that they will test Arizona, having watched Arizona play at home and almost lose to Minnesota and almost lose to Cincinnati and then get thoroughly thrashed by the Seahawks in week 17. I don't think they are quite the team that everybody thinks they are, and I was one of those people, before the week 17, I kind of thought, wow, this team's going to be the favorites for the Super Bowl. And then you kind of just see what the Seahawks did to them and you think, yeah, maybe not. And maybe there is a bit of a grounding there. And, they have lost Tyrann Mathieu as well. So, I think it's going to be a fascinating game, but I do think that Arizona, I think it could be high scoring. I don't think it's going to be a blowout. And I see Arizona winning by, maybe 6 points, something like that. And they'll be waiting for whoever wins between Carolina and Seattle.
Speaking of Aaron Rodgers, like I said, I rewatched the Packers game. They needed a bit of a comeback, so you take that into account. But just keep in mind, Aaron Rodgers, 4 touchdowns against the Carolina Panthers' vaunted defense. So there was something to get around there for Aaron Rodgers, and they had that ball at the end of the game, down 8 points, and could not convert a touchdown right inside the red zone there, even when gifted an opportunity on just a horrendous interception by Cam Newton that at the end of the game when they were leading, that gave Green Bay the ball back unbelievably with a chance to tie the game, and it didn't work out. That being said, Green Bay not a good enough on defense, and certainly not good enough on offense when their defense isn't that great right now. So their offense just not good enough, especially against the Arizona Cardinals. Rodgers will be contained once again, playing a good pass defense, and the Cardinals just have a little bit too much for them. So I expect Arizona to advance to the NFC Championship. If Seattle advances, I mean, it's going to be a pretty epic NFC Championship. You get 3 straight NFC Championships, one against San Francisco, one against Green Bay, and one against Arizona. I mean, what an epic NFC Championship lineup. And then if they do advance, I wouldn't mind not seeing New England just for the sake of variety. The same reasons maybe not seeing Denver, but it's such a different team, the Denver Broncos. I just saw today that the Denver Broncos, I mean, this is only 2 years ago that they were in the Super Bowl 48 against the Seahawks. 6 starters remain. And one of them is Peyton Manning, who got benched. So that team has been dismantled, and I think a lot of it has to do with the way the Seahawks beat them in the Super Bowl was John Elway saying, oh, shit, we need a defense. So they went out there, they got a defense, and now their defense has put them in a position to play the Steelers on Sunday night, Sunday afternoon after the Seahawks-Panthers game. The Steelers have had their problems, but the Denver Broncos, obviously with their problems, Peyton Manning led the NFL in interceptions, and he missed like 6 games. So Steelers, Broncos, what do you think?
I think if the Steelers were healthy, then I would pick them to win, and I would have no problem with that. I do wonder whether or not Ben Roethlisberger being hurt and whether Antonio Brown, he may be out because he's in the concussion protocol. And, they're not going to get DeAngelo Williams back. They're already without Le'Veon Bell. So I think that there could be some issues there. Having said that, are Denver one of the worst teams to be the number 1 seed that you've seen in a long time? I mean, they don't know who their quarterback should be. I mean, Manning was terrible during the regular season and would have set records for interceptions at the pace he was going. Brock Osweiler came in and didn't really sort of own the job, and now he's hurt. What running back does Denver have that sort of stands out? And Demaryius Thomas, who's arguably their best receiving option, has had a bit of a down year and is incredibly erratic and inconsistent. They brought in Vernon Davis and he's done absolutely nothing. So when you look at that offense, you just think, I'm not too sure about it. And also you've got to counter the fact that the coach, Gary Kubiak, his style of play relies on a lot of bootlegs and getting out of the pocket and stuff like that. Peyton Manning's not going to do any of that stuff, and that was part of the issue in the first place. Now, defensively, they're pretty good. Von Miller wasn't in the Super Bowl that Seattle won, and there's 1 or 2 other pieces in there that they've brought in since. But, I just think it's kind of a review of the AFC that they're the number 1 seed. New England don't look great. And then you've got Kansas City, who are kind of the hot team, and then Pittsburgh, who would be one of the hotter teams, but they're banged up and hurt. So, I still think there's a very good chance that Kansas City or Pittsburgh are going to come out of this. And it wouldn't surprise me if the AFC Championship game was Kansas City against Pittsburgh.
Yeah, going that way, a wild card AFC Championship game. In that case, you would be having Kansas City hosting the AFC Championship. Very unlikely that would have seen something you would have seen. I mean, Kansas City was 1-5. It's insane. But they could host, and it's very I don't know if it's likely, but it's very probable that they could be hosting the Steelers. My issue, I think the Steelers are an interesting case of strength of schedule as well. Obviously, they went 10-6 this year, and then they did that with injuries to Ben Roethlisberger. They suffered, other injuries. Their strength of schedule was 7th. So they came away with 10 wins with a tough strength of schedule and without Ben Roethlisberger. It does depend a lot on the health of Antonio Brown and Roethlisberger, and you got to adjust to that. That being said, I think that when you've got the Denver Broncos playing defense in the way that they're playing it, they had the 10th toughest schedule in the league. They are the number one defense. If Manning can just sort of reel it in, and you don't have to rely on Manning. I think that Manning has always been better when his teams don't rely on him. There's a reason why he's only won one Super Bowl despite all of these years of being the greatest quarterback of all time. So there's nothing necessarily that wrong with a lesser Manning, especially if the defense is making up for it. So I think that'll be definitely probably the best game of the weekend is the Steelers and the Broncos. Maybe it's somewhere up there with the Seahawks and the Panthers, but I do have pretty positive feelings about Seattle's chances. And I guess that's it for this week on 3000 NFL Mock Draft, unless you have any final thoughts, Rob.
Well, I hope that as much as I love talking about the draft and, it's a real passion, I've become accustomed to Seattle taking their postseason play right through to February. So if they could manage to just find their way to do that again, that'd be quite nice. And as much as this is essentially a college and draft podcast, I think that it'd be great to be sat here next week talking about the NFC Championship game that's coming up. I sincerely hope the Seahawks do it. I just think that win against Minnesota has given them, given us all sort of like some relief and some belief that, maybe they can make a charge now. I think it's going to be a great test in Carolina. And if they come through that, whoever they end up facing in the NFC Championship game, they're going to have a decent shot. And it'd be great to see them back at the Super Bowl. I sincerely hope they do it. And that we're talking about either the 30th or the 31st pick in a few weeks' time as opposed to anything else, because I'm not ready to sort of solely focus on the draft just yet.
Have you seen Four Falls in Buffalo?
Four Falls in Buffalo? No, I have not.
It's on Netflix, at least in America. I don't know about the UK. If they've got all the 30 for 30s on your Netflix there in the UK, then it's probably there. But it's about the Bills in the 90s and the 4 straight Super Bowls that they went to. I watched it this morning. It's a good watch. Obviously, I think you sort of know the ending. They don't win.
Don't win any of them.
But it does, talk to all the players and the coaches. And one of the things I really liked was Marv Levy, the head coach of the Bills at the time. I mean, it's funny because it's like you look back and it's the 90s and Marv Levy is an old guy. And it's like, I mean, no offense, but he's got the white hair and he's clearly like one of the older coaches in the league, and it's 1990 or whatever. And he was there for all the Super Bowls that they lost. And they're interviewing him now in 2015 or last year. And he's still got all the energy. He hasn't lost anything. Like he, as far as I know, could be, 82 or 85 years old. And it's all the same there. And it reminds me so much of Pete Carroll. It makes me think that we could be, it's just so funny to think about maybe 20 years from now in 2035, Pete Carroll doing interviews, and he's still the same energetic guy and I think he's going to be talking about the 2012 to 2015, at least, Seattle Seahawks and their era. And if they go to 3 straight Super Bowls, we're talking about a team, the first team in NFC history to ever do that.
If they win the Super Bowl, you're talking about, if they go there for sure, then Russell Wilson, the first quarterback to go to 3 in his first 4 years. If he wins 2 championships in his first 4 years, if they do 2 in 3 years with 3 straight Super Bowls, then you have a rivalry with the Dallas Cowboys and the New England Patriots and the San Francisco 49ers and the Pittsburgh Steelers and the Miami Dolphins and other teams that were that great at one time. And it's really feels like they could do that with 2 more wins. But if they get 3 more wins, then you're talking about one of the greatest dynasties of all time. And how they move forward. Well, I guess, how they move forward, whether they're picking 31st or not, that's going to dictate a lot, because the Dallas Cowboys haven't won a Super Bowl since 1995. Who would have guessed that? The San Francisco 49ers haven't won a Super Bowl since 1994. The Miami Dolphins haven't won a Super Bowl since, 1972. The Pittsburgh Steelers went a long time without it. The Green Bay Packers went a long time without it. There's a model, and nobody can figure it out because the model changes so much, because they don't want you to figure it out. They don't want you to.
That is a great point, Kenny. Just on this point, the expectation with Seattle now is that they're going to win the title every year. And if they don't win a championship, then there's disappointment. It's easy to forget that it is actually quite the thing to sort of be able to sit here and sort of know that your team is a contender, that we're looking at the playoffs and we're not like, think about the Minnesota fans. They were probably thinking, let's just win at least 1 playoff game. Let's show some progression. Let's beat a good team at home. And then whatever happens the rest of the way, fair enough. Seattle isn't thinking that way. We're all thinking, can they get to the Super Bowl every year? And they're probably going to be able to do this for maybe another 2 or 3 years. And then that's going to be it. And it's going to move on, and times are going to change, and they're going to have to try and rebuild various parts of this team. It's very easy to sort of look beyond this and either think it has to be a Super Bowl or bust, or not enjoy sort of what is going on now. Just enjoy these weeks. Just enjoy watching this team, because in no time at all, Pete's not going to be there anymore. Richard Sherman's going to be in his 30s. Michael Bennett and Cliff Averill are going to be in their mid-30s. And, these great guys that you're enjoying watching right now, they ain't going to be here forever. So it's sometimes easy to sort of get too intense and too keen on the victory, and sort of, taking that step back and concentrating on the journey rather than the destination. It's something that I've certainly forgot to do a few times this year. And I think sort of trying to appreciate every moment of following this era of Seahawks football is something that we really should treasure.
Yeah, it's phenomenal how good the players are and how much fun the personalities are and how much great it is to watch each individual game, and to not take for granted the fact that the Seahawks have played. This will be their 9th playoff game in 4 years, which is just pretty much, not something that's heard of very often at all, to get that many playoff games. I mean, you could talk about the amount of playoff games that franchises that have lasted for decades have had, and it's less sometimes than Russell Wilson in his 4-year career. If I just want to give you a frame of reference. So win or lose, the Seahawks have a playoff game this weekend, and that's not something to take for granted. It's not take for granted to think that anyone listens to this show that lasts for an hour and a half, but we want to thank you for listening to 3000 NFL Mock Draft. I want to thank the people who have donated through Patreon on behalf of Real in the Field Goals or 3000 NFL Mock Draft. Follow on Twitter, Rob Staten, at Rob Staten with an O, not in the Rob, in the Staten. And, well, there is one in the O as well. Isn't that right, Rob?
Yes, that's correct, yeah.
Rob Staten and SeahawksDraftBlog.com, FieldGoals.com, and I'm going to have just a whole lot of stuff on SportsOnEarth.com this week. I had like 5 or 6 articles up there last week about the Seahawks game. I'll have a bunch starting on Thursday with the Seahawks and Panthers. We're going to be talking about Newton versus Wilson. I'm going to be talking about some of the other MVPs in this game that aren't quarterbacks to look out for, and maybe a look back at the 2005 NFC Championship game between Seattle and Carolina leading up to the game on Sunday. And yeah, I think that's it. Rob, anything else that they should check out?
No, if anybody gets a chance, I've had a chance to read Kenny's pieces this week, sort of building up towards Carolina. He put a couple out at the same time, so I would definitely go and recommend reading those and just enjoy it. Just enjoy the rest of the week. Don't just enjoy the anticipation of this game, and let's hope that this time next week we're talking about another Seahawks win, and we're looking ahead to another great NFC Championship.
Yes, enjoy it. If you're listening to this on Wednesday, you got 4 nights of sleep before the game. If you're listening to it another time, even less. So that's even better. 3,000 NFL mock draft. Oh, let's go out on the right note. Let me see. Hold on a second. We have the new great podcast theme, and I just want to play it to send us out.
Let's hear it.
I should have thought of this ahead of time. Now I have to go search in my mail to find it. But his name is, I don't know if I even said this earlier.
No, give him any credit.
I'm sorry. I did not give him any credit. But I want to make sure I'm getting it right. I think he's Swedish, maybe. Soren Raven. And it is a great name. I'm assuming perhaps not completely accurate to the one on his birth certificate, but it still works. And here we go. I had to find it, and I found it. And I want to thank Soren for sending this along. Let's hear it one more time. 3,000 NFL mock draft.
3,000 NFL mock draft.
3,000 NFL mock draft.
With your friends Kenneth and Rob. Talking about the NFL and the draft and the Seahawks.
3,000 NFL mock draft.
3,000 NFL mock draft.